Hey, what's going on, YouTube? With these two new mage heroes out, Young Ming and Gamora here, a lot of people have asked me about their war pets. It really comes down to the Flaming Manticore versus the Sapphire. A lot of people have been asking me, like, hey, the Sapphire, it came out as long as War Pets has been out. It's a Generation 1 war pet. Well, why is it still competitive? Why is it still, in most circumstances, the best magic pet there is, right? The Flaming Manticore is pretty good. You got to be using the Flaming Manticore with Young Ming, or probably at least Tohar, to get full value from it. It's doing more single target damage than the Sapphire, but the AOE on a top end Sapphire is still better. The other argument for the Flaming Manticore is that, like, if you build it out to sort of like the B plus level, it's better. But the reason is that Sapphire really depends on having that 310 spirit and that Amber skill, right? And what obviously the Amber skill is just the Amber skill. You save up for Amber, however long that takes you. But I know people that have spent like 5,000 regeneration potions looking for 310 spirit, and at least 7 slots and some decent intelligence and luck, and just have never gotten there. And if you have that bad luck, or if you want to build out multiple sapphires and you're still, you still can't get that, it's pretty rough. So today I want to talk through why the Sapphire is such an evergreen pet, why it works not only with the Generation 1 heroes, but really all the magic heroes that come after it. And individual pets may be better for their generation's heroes, like you could say the Flaming Manticore at least has an argument to be better for Young Ming and Gamora. But like second place is clearly the Sapphire, and when we have the G5 mages come out, a year from now or whatever, I think there's a very good chance the Sapphire will probably be pretty good for them too, whereas the Flaming Manticore probably won't be any good for them. So that's what today's video is about. It's about the Sapphire Phaedrake, why it's like such a good pet, and why it remains evergreen. These other magic pets just are losing their relevance, are kind of fading from the meta. Now, if you want to know why the Sapphire is such a consistently good pet, I think the easiest explanation comes down to when the developers like first were making war pets, making the war pet system, like they didn't fully understand war pets to the same extent they understand them today. So you take a look at like all the later generation war pets, and not just magic pets, but everything that came after the first generation, and they all have like abilities that sort of tie themselves to the heroes, right? The Shadow Phaedrake here, it's got a skill that makes your legion and only your legion do extra single target damage. Well, most mages are doing AoE, but of course the Generation 2 heroes, Bird and Tohar, were only doing single target damage, and so we all kind of like the Sapphire for them and made sense, right? You look at the third generation heroes, the Seraphic Phaedrake, it has a mechanic that basically when you, through an innate skill, give the enemy a debuff or you give yourself a buff, you get these stacks of Entreaty. And really Thundolin and Thalia were doing a ton of that. And as we get to the Generation 4 magic pet, it's kind of the same thing, right? When you're dealing magic damage via an innate skill. Well, all heroes do that, but really only Young Ming, and like I said, to a lesser extent, Tohar, really empower this to the major effect, right? The Sapphire Phaedrake, it does just damage to a legion. Obviously, if you have the Amber skill, you can get it up to 3 legions. You might not know this, when the Sapphire Phaedrake first came out, it actually hit 2 legions. They've nerfed this over time. Now, back in that time, it was impossible to upgrade the talent skills. Maybe you had a 1-star. I had like a 0-star Pain Bloom. That's the best I could get. And so these things weren't that powerful back then. But imagine if you could hit 4 legions with this thing, and that would be awesome. Anyway, Pain Bloom just hits a legion, and if you have the Amber skill, it hits 3 legions. And like, that's it, right? There's no internal mechanics. There's no like, if you cast Scorch or whatever, you get an additional 50% damage. It just does flat damage. Now, to be fair, the Pet Shop skill Intense Pain Bloom does have this mechanic on it when you do, Scorch, Hoarfrost, and Snare, right? And those are the Generation 1 hero special effects. Pain Bloom does more damage. And so the difference between the Sapphire and all the other magic pets, and really all the Generation 2 pets and beyond, is that the thing that tied the war pet to the hero was not in its talent skill. It was in its Pet Shop skill, okay? Now, you might say, okay, so they broke it out from the talent skill instead and they put in the Pet Shop skill instead. Well, why is that such a big deal? Well, it's 2 reasons this is a really big deal. And the first reason is that, just sort of the mechanics of war pets, you can only have up to 3 skills of each attribute type, right? 3 intelligence or luck or spirit skills or what have you. Well, when it comes to magic pets, their talent skills are all intelligence based. Okay, that's one easy one. And then the follow-up package, right? Follow-up itself is intelligence based, and that's sort of the way to get a second damage source on your war pet. That's intelligence, so that's 2 as well. And then you have part of the magic crit package, elemental harmony, a third intelligence skill, right? And so you're always forced to choose. You can only have 3 of these 4 intelligence skills, obviously. Well, you're always going to have the talent skill. That's pretty obvious. I think you pretty much always want follow-up. And then you get to choose between these two. Well, here's the thing, right? When people are building out, like new players will come to me and say, hey, I'm building on a Sapphire. What should I put on it? Should I put Intense Pain Bloom? Well, if you're like in your Generation 1, you have Lily Valen or whatever, Intense Pain Bloom's a fine skill, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But I always recommend people go with Elemental Harmony instead. One of the reasons is if you put Elemental Harmony on, you can use this Sapphire with anything, right? If you take a look at Xenophon here, Xenophon was originally with Lily Valen. Last season I moved it over to my Mu Thea March. I mean, it's doing great. But like, there's no downside to that, right? There's nothing on this Sapphire that ties it to the Generation 1 mages. Neither Mu nor Thea give you anything that helps Intense Pain Bloom, but I don't mind because I don't even have Intense Pain Bloom on the pet, right? And so every other like Generation 2 pet and on that has the tied to the hero mechanic on the talent skill, there's no getting away from that. But with Intense Pain Bloom being the pet shop skill, yeah, you can easily get away from that. The other reason that the Sapphire is still so good versus all the other pets really has to do with follow-up, okay? And the thing with follow-up is this is the way to get a secondary damage source on your war pet, right? As I've mentioned before, each of the pets, depending on the type of troop it's associated with, has a way to get a secondary damage source on the war pet. The Fierce Attack package, that's really for your cav marches. Occasionally you might see it in an infantry march and maybe the G4 archers, but really this is the cav skill, right? Chain Strike, this is very clearly for your archer marches. And then of course Counter Strike, this is really associated with your infantry marches. Follow-up obviously is the one for the magic marches. Okay, no issues. But here's the deal with follow-up. Unlike those other 3 skills, unlike Chain Strike and Fierce Attack and Counter Strike, follow-up recasts your talent skill. When you get the follow-up trigger, it's basically like you cast the talent skill again. Follow-up imposes a tax on that trigger. It always goes off at a fraction of the initial damage. You can see here it's 15% of the first casting. That doesn't take your intelligence into account. But let's think about the Sapphire again, okay? If you have, Pain Bloom and follow-up and Intense Pain Bloom on your Sapphire, what's going to happen? Well, you go through the rage cycle, your primary and then your deputy cast their rage skills. And then your Sapphire casts Pain Bloom, right? And let's say you have Intense Pain Bloom on there. It takes advantage of every time, you got Scorch or Hoarfrost or Ensnare, and you're doing some extra damage, right? But as you cast that Pain Bloom, right, it essentially clears these stacks of Intense Pain Bloom. And then follow-up goes off 2 seconds later. And then do you have any additional stacks for the Intense Pain Bloom? You might have none, or you might have a very low amount, but it's going to impose an additional tax on that follow-up cost. There's a chance that the follow-up cast might rob the initial cast for round 2, right? So the round 1 follow-up, it's got a chance to rob round 2 Pain Bloom. That doesn't always happen, but it is a risk. And it is just another reason why you probably want to go with Elemental Harmony over Intense Pain Bloom. Okay, but at least the good news on the Sapphire is, right, you can avoid this follow-up problem because this, like, building up buff mechanic, it only occurs through the pet shop skill. It's not tied to Pain Bloom itself. When we got to the Shadow Hunter, this really wasn't a big problem with it either. In fact, follow-up was great because the captive debuff, it always goes off at essentially 100% effectiveness with follow-up, so wasn't a big deal with the Shadow Phaedrake. But when the Seraphic came around, boy was that a problem, right? Because Soul Source really depends on stacks of Entreaty, right? You see max 4 stacks here. But if you get the Pet Shop skill, you can get a lot more stacks, right? 40 Spirit gives you an additional maximum. And so Soul Source is really dependent on you building up lots of stacks of Entreaty when you build it out to like a very high level. But follow up messes up with that because the follow up cast is not going to have lots of stacks of Entreaty, and there's also a chance that it'll rob the next Soul Source, right? And this is one of the reasons why the Seraphic is such an underperformer relative to the other war pets. Right, and that's why we come back to the Flaming Manticore, and this is like it's an issue with the Flaming Manticore, but not as big of an issue with the Seraphic. And that's kind of why the Sapphire is still a really strong pet, right? They made it pretty strong to begin with. In fact, they've had to nerf it, and it still remains very strong. But it's never tied to these buff mechanics that, in particular with magic pets, suffer from this follow-up tax that goes off on them. And it's not tied to any particular hero. And you kind of see this with the adoption of like a Mu Thea March as a very strong, magic march, right? Both Mu and Thea, they're both overall heroes. They have no magic trees whatsoever. I find these two to be the strongest magic march there is, at least prior to the Generation 4 magic heroes. And what's the best pet for them? I think it's the Sapphire. If we get more generic heroes that like are good with magic marches, Sapphire is going to work great with them too. The Sapphire is really your safest bet going forward. And so if a new player comes to me, right, and says, hey, I have access to all the war pets. I want to be a mage main. What pet should I focus on first? I'm going to tell them a Sapphire. Because even though the Flaming Manticore is great for the newest heroes, Sapphire is great for everyone. And that's why it's an evergreen pet. And hey, that's all I got for you today. And until next time, you stay classy, Belleron.